Hey everyone, it's Michael. Hope you're all getting on well. Hope you're all having a good week. So, part of the homework that I've given you is to read through the PowerPoints on audience, purpose, and message. And it also includes some information on summarising as well. And I gave you that as homework to read through the PowerPoints, but I thought some of you might prefer a video as well. So I've created this video so that you have the choice. You can either read through the PowerPoints or you can watch this video. And as you'll see, there are subtitles at the bottom as well. So if you're not able to listen to it with the sound on, you can follow along with the subtitles as well. So I'm going to start first of all by talking about the purpose of a text. But before I do that, let's have a think about what we mean by text. Because when we say text, we normally think of something written with words and letters. The same, for example, when you send a text. So, rather than talk on the phone, we send a text, we send something that's written. But in communications, text can refer to a whole array of different things. It can refer to a whole array of materials. And in communications, when we say text, basically we're referring to any published material. Normally copyrighted, but it doesn't have to be. For example, a text message you send to your friend is not or a WhatsApp message is not copyrighted, but in communications we talk about any form of material with information, and sometimes is copyrighted, that would be text. So it can include an essay, or a news article or a book. That's what we usually think of with text. It could be an official report from an organisation like the NHS or from Ayrshire College, but it can also include material in other formats as well. So a video, a song, a video game, a movie, episode of a TV series, those are all forms of text. And when they're copyrighted and we talk about them in an essay for college or for university, we always have to give a citation. And you'll learn more about citations in a future class. But we always have to give a citation if it's copyrighted work. And I've marked essays before where people have talked about computer games and they've not passed the essay because they forgot to give a citation for the video game. So it's very important, citations when we're talking about uh, texts, copyrighted texts, but we will learn more about that in the future. So, as I said, a text is basically any form of material with information or words. So, as I said, it takes a lot of different forms, like writing, essay, news article, report, but it can also be other formats like video or audio as well. So now that we know what a text is, let's have a think about the different purposes of a text. Authors and creators don't usually create a text for no reason. There is a purpose to them. Okay, and the most common purposes, you will find these on your summary sheet that I put on my learning or gave you in the class. So the five main purposes of a text might be to entertain or amuse. It might be to persuade someone about something. It could be to express a personal point of view. It might be to inform or educate. And it might be to highlight an issue, possibly a controversial issue, but it might be to highlight an issue. When we're talking about the type of texts that you require for college or uni work, the most common ones will be the last four: to persuade, to express a personal point of view, to inform or educate, and to highlight an issue. And I'll argue that actually it's the last two that are the most important for college or university work: to inform or to educate. I want to stress, however, that a text can have more than one purpose, okay? Or they might contain features from the different purposes. So just because something is created to inform or educate doesn't mean it can't also entertain or amuse people as well. So very often a text can have more than one purpose. And some of the features of a text that have these different purposes. I'm not going to go through all of them. You can read about them in the summary sheet or on the PowerPoint slides. But for example, a text that is designed to entertain or amuse, you would expect to see jokes, puns, funny descriptions, an informal writing style, things like that. A text that's used to persuade, a text that's used to persuade will possibly be biased towards one side of an issue or another. It might refer directly to the reader. It might address you directly by saying things like, if you do this, if you go here, if you read that. Um, it might contain arguments that support the writer's point of view, but leave out arguments that don't support it. And it might contain emotive words, words that are designed to make you feel things like, so newspapers are very good at this, for example. So, heartbreaking, tragic, words like that. A text that's designed to express a personal point of view will very often use I. Okay, so I did this, I know this is my experience, and things like that. And in writing for assessments, we tend to avoid that. We tend not to use I. They might have words that describe feelings or reactions, very similar to what I talked about with emotive language for texts that are designed to persuade. They might also have a photo of the author at the top as well. A text that's designed to inform or educate, and as I said, in college and university, this will be the kind of most common one that you use. So they will use a layout with headings or bullet points or subheadings. The language will be normally clear and easy to understand, although believe me, that's not always the case. Some academic writers like to use complicated words, complicated vocabulary. Texts that are designed to inform or educate will also include numbers, statistics, charts, or diagrams, and they'll also contain facts rather than opinions. And when I say facts, I mean facts that are supported by evidence, and evidence is something that, again, we'll talk about in another class. A text that is designed to highlight a specific issue, possibly a controversial issue like immigration or something like that, they will give facts or stories that the readers would unlikely be familiar with. Okay, they might use dramatic statements, or they might use a lot of question marks or exclamation marks. They might contain facts or statistics, but ones that are designed to shock you, and they might contain quotes from experts as well. So you can see that although we have 5 different purposes for a text, you can see that sometimes there's a little bit of a crossover, okay? So although a text might have one purpose, one key purpose, they might have other purposes as well, and they might have features of the other purposes too. So now that we've talked about what is a text and what is the purpose of a text, I'm also going to talk a little bit about audience. And again, I won't go through all of the information here because you have it on your summary sheet or on the PowerPoint slides. Audiences can be very broad or very narrow. So an audience can be, can include a lot of people or a very small subsection of people. Generally, audiences fall into a few broad categories. So one broad category for an audience would be children. We get books and videos specifically created for children, and then the same for teenagers as well. But even within those two audience groups, we have a lot of different subsections. So with children, for example, a book that's written for a 3-year-old will not be the same as a book written for a 9-year-old. So even within that broad category of children, we have a few different subcategories, and the same with teenagers as well. Okay. Texts created for children will normally use simple language and style. They may be illustrated with pictures, but not always, and they often include humour as well. For teenagers, you'll see a lot of the same features, but usually they'll use the words used will include slang, and there'll be stories that are quite easy to read and easy to approach as well. For adults, we have three main categories. We have general, educated, and specialist. Okay, so general adult books, those adult books will have adult language and content. There might be about issues that are likely to affect or interest most adults. So, like factual topics might include tax, health, money, children, or, fiction books, storybooks, might include elements of these things, or might include elements of romance and things like that. For for the educated group of adults, these are kind of quality papers and magazines. So someone who has a good vocabulary, can read very confidently, um, we'll see complex word choice, references to history or culture, and things like that. And then specialists, text for adult specialists, this will be for a very specific topic. So, for example, um, adults who have an interest in music, and you'll see lots of context specific vocabulary that a reader who's interested in the topic will know, but if you know nothing about the topic, you won't have a clue what that vocabulary is. And then we have some other broad groups. So, for example, retired or older people. So, texts that appeal to the retired or older people might relate to things like health or tax, or things from history in the past, like the Second World War. We also have audiences divided by gender. So, again, broad categories of male and female. And an example would be magazines dedicated to men's health, or magazines dedicated to women's health. So we have these broad categories of audience, but as I said earlier, even within those things, we have sub categories, like subcategories for the children audience. And also, just because a text resonates with one audience doesn't mean that people in another audience won't enjoy it. Harry Potter is a very good example of this. So, Harry Potter was written originally for children, but actually, a lot of adults found it entertaining and enjoyable as well. So, although we categorize audiences in broad groups, audiences are very, very varied. So, as well as understanding the purpose of a text and the intended audience for a text, the other key thing that we need to know when we're analysing a text is, what is the main message of the text? Now, the main idea or the main message is the central point, the most important point that the author wants to give you. It should be concise, clear, and specific. And if you can summarize the main message well, you should be able to do it in one sentence. There are four key steps to identifying the main message. So the first step is to skim the text. So that means concentrate first on reading the headings, the subheadings, the first and the last paragraphs, and the concluding section as well. And if you read all of those things, you should be able to understand 90% of the text just by reading those key areas of the text. The second step is to identify keywords and phrases. So look for things that are repeated, look for concepts that appear throughout. Step number 3 is to locate the author's purpose statement. Okay, so search for any explicit statements, such as, this article aims to talk about X, Y, and Z, or this article explains. Towards the bottom of a text, anything that says in conclusion, okay, that will help you to understand the main message. And step number 4, take the information you found and try to summarize it in one sentence, possibly 2 sentences, I think is okay, but try to summarize it in one sentence. And if you can follow those steps, you'll be able to identify the main message. As part of your assessment, you will have to summarize key information about a particular text. And in the PowerPoint, I included a link to a video that gives information about how to summarize key points in a text. I strongly recommend that you go and watch that video. It's very, very short, but it gives you a really good explanation of how to summarize texts. And in basic terms, really, you want to concentrate on the bigger picture rather than the tiny details. So in the video, it gives the explanation of summarising the cure for robot flu and trying to decide what's important and what's not. The weather on the day that you found the cure to robot flu is not important, but the ingredients for the cure to the robot flu, that is important. So as I said, have a watch of this video, and it demonstrates very well how to summarize key information. But essentially what you want to do is create a map, not give a picture perfect image or a photograph capturing every detail. Another thing that you will have to do as part of the assessment is to analyze the language that's used in the text. Okay. Um, and for that, you have to consider a few different things. So we have to talk about macro analysis and micro analysis, and I'll talk a little bit more about them in a second. We have to decide if the language is appropriate. We have to think about the complexity of the language, and we have to talk about, or we have to think about literary devices. So I'm going to talk about all of those now. So the first thing we have to think about is analysing the language at the macro level and the micro level. Macro level analysis is basically, it's the big picture, okay, the main point of the text. So that includes the things that we have considered already. So, summarising the text, the key points, finding the key message. Micro level, and that's what you'll have to think about when you analyze the language, that's looking at specific words or specific phrases in order to emphasize or illustrate a point, to illustrate the key message. There are different literary devices that tend to get used, especially in general texts, not so much academic text, but in general texts. There are different literary devices that are used, and they can be very helpful for illustrating key points or to emphasize the argument. So I'm going to talk about a few of these at the moment, which is analogy, alliteration, rhyming and assonance, euphemism and hyperbole, similes and metaphors. So the first one is analogy. Analogy explains or clarifies or simplifies a concept by using a comparison. And in the PowerPoint slide, I gave a link to a TikTok video, which I recommend you watch. And it explains the relationship between the four countries of the UK, but does it in a way that uses the illustration of four men sharing an apartment. Okay, and it's a really good example of analogy, so I recommend that you watch this one. Another analogy that a previous student gave to me was explaining the offside rule by shopping in Primark. Again, very good example of analogy. So analogies are used to clarify or simplify a concept by comparing it to something else. Alliteration is the repetition of a consonant sound at the beginning, usually the beginning of two or more words. So an example would be the repetition of the k sound in the sentence, what he said was cruel, cold, crushing, and callous. So we have that k, 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 k. And it's effective because it helps us to remember it. Assonance is very similar, but it's the repetition of a vowel sound instead of the consonant sound. So the example I gave in the PowerPoint is, about the glade in a frail agony of grace, she trailed her rags through dust and ashes, which is taken from a book. So there in that sentence, we have the repetition of the A sound. Glade, frail, grace, and trail. Okay, so assonance is the repetition of a vowel sound. But you'll notice that with assonance, the words don't rhyme, and that's because rhyming is a different literary device. So rhyming involves the repetition of consonant and vowel sound together. So for example, the rhyming of at, the at sound in the phrase, the fat cat sat on the mat. Okay, and all of these are useful, especially alliteration and rhyming, because they help us to remember things. They store the pattern in our brain. A euphemism is a word that's used to replace another when the original word might be considered rude or offensive or too blunt. So, for example, in English, we tend to consider it a little bit rude to describe someone as fat. So, we might use a different word instead, like big boned or overweight. Another example would be instead of saying someone is unemployed, we tend to say they are between jobs. Hyperbole is exaggeration, okay, and it's not something that gets taken literal. So if someone says, "Oh, I've told you this a million times," the chances are they haven't told you a million times. They're using hyperbole to exaggerate, and that's done in order to emphasize a point. Similes and metaphors are again a, two different ways to use comparisons to compare one thing to another, but there's a slight difference in how they are used. Similes tend to say that something is as something else, or that X is like Y. So, for example, songs use this very much, okay? So, if you know the Dolly Parton song Jolene, it uses similes quite a lot. So, in the words, your smile is like a breath of spring. So, that's a simile because it says something is like something else. Your voice is soft like summer rain. And again, we have something is like something else. Bonnie Tyler's song, Total Eclipse of the Heart, that tends to use metaphors. So, well, a simile says something is like something, a metaphor says that something is something. So, I don't know what to do and I'm always in the dark. Okay, so it's not saying it's like I'm always in the dark, it's saying I'm always in the dark. We're living in a powder keg and giving off sparks. Again, both of those lines are metaphors because it's not saying it feels like we're living in a powder keg or it's as if we're living in a powder keg. It says we are. So similes and metaphors, very good for making comparisons. But a simile says something is like something or something is as something, and a metaphor just says that something is something. So all of these literary devices can be very useful to illustrate and emphasize arguments. As I said previously, though, literary devices are more appropriate for generalized and some specialist texts. However, for the expert reader or the academic reader, you wouldn't find a lot of these literary devices. In academic texts, official reports, or professional documents, we try to avoid them. Academic texts, like textbooks designed for students or research articles, they will normally have different features of their language. So, for example, the language will be precise. You won't see something in a psychology book, for example, that says this has huge consequences because huge is too general, it's hyperbole. We tend to be more specific. Okay. And again, text of this type will be specific. So it won't say everyone, you won't see something in an academic text that says everyone recognizes the importance of safety in work, because not everyone does recognize that. So we have to be more specific. Okay. You will also see a lot more vocabulary that's specifically related to the topic. So, for example, if you're reading something about education or teaching, you might come across the word pedagogy because that's a word specific to the field of teaching. Someone who doesn't know about education or teaching, they might not know what that word is. So you'll come across a lot of subject specific words and terms. The language used also tends to be quite formal in academic texts. So, for example, you'll use words like nevertheless, whereas whereas if you are talking to your friends or your family, you might just use the word but or however. Okay, but academic texts tend to use more formal vocabulary. Um, academic texts tend to fall into two main categories, especially at university level. So we tend to use textbooks and we tend to use research articles. So in the PowerPoint slide, I've got some of the features of both of these. And again, I'll talk a bit more about them in another lesson. But to give you the kind of list, in research articles, you'll come across an abstract. An abstract is the thing that appears first underneath the title of a research article, and it's a 100 to 150 word summary of the whole document. And what that does is allow you to decide whether you want to spend time reading the rest of the document. Okay, so always start with the abstract because that'll let you decide whether it is worth reading the rest of it. You'll also have a set structure with set headings, for example, introduction, methodology, results. So you tend to see those headings in almost every research article. A research article will also give you details about an original piece of research that has been done by the author themselves. They're usually between 14 and 25 pages long, and they will contain language specific to that field, which we very often call jargon. They will also use diagrams, charts, or images, and more rarely, photos. You might see some photos in specific fields like archaeology, for example, but usually it's diagrams and charts that are contained in research articles. Textbooks, on the other hand, they will have chapters arranged by topic. They'll have chapter introductions, subheadings, as well as a conclusion or a summary. They'll have relevant diagrams like charts or tables or graphs, but they might also include images related to the topic as well, particularly photos. Textbooks tend to not have original research. They tend to give an overview of previous research that has been done by other authors, but textbooks don't tend to contain original research that would normally be in a research article. Textbooks give an introduction to the main topics, ideas, and previous research. They will also have an index at the back so that you can search easily for key terms or key words. They'll contain a glossary, which is like a mini dictionary at the back, and they will also sometimes contain practice activities or questions. So that's some of the main features between research articles and textbooks. So the main question we have to think about is when we're looking for sources of information for college work or university work, especially the research articles or the textbooks, we need to think about where are we going to find these. The best places to start are the LRC and Google Scholar. And in the next class, I'll be talking more about those. And we'll put some of this into practice as well. Okay, so I know that's a lot of information, but as I said, this is kind of to summarize the PowerPoint videos. So I hope you found this video helpful, and we'll put into practice some of the things that I've talked about in this video. So have a good week, and I'll see you in the next class. Bye.